Hello, everyone. This is going to be 5.1, the American Revolution. So, we are going to get started with a quote from Patrick Henry, one of his most famous quotes, and one of the most famous quotes from this time of building tension between the British and the Americans. He said at the end of a speech, "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Well, he kind of borrowed this from a play actually called Cato, but it is he who said it at the end of one of his speeches. And I mean, yeah, honestly, the name of our book is Give Me Liberty. So obviously, we're going to quote this at the beginning. So, the years after the French and Indian War, which we talked about at the end of chapter 4, saw America go back and forth. We're in a bad relationship, basically, with England. There's a lot of tension and animosity on both sides, a lot of making up and breaking up. Um, we see angry protests mixed with attempts of peace and reconciliation. And at the forefront of all of this is disturbances. Of all these disturbances were the beginnings of calls for liberty, which was kind of a new word, a new, or at least a new term for the idea that had before not been well defined. But it involved things like more rights than what we felt we had at the time. And so the American Revolution was this struggle for liberty begun by the Americans because of the British trying to impose a greater direct control over the Americas. So let's look at the beginnings of the American Revolution. We kind of started with the French and Indian War, but the French and Indian War really sped up the revolution. May not have happened if the French and Indian War hadn't happened. It was the cost, basically. The French, I'm sorry, not the French, the British, there we go, the British had spent a lot of money beating the French in the French and Indian War, and so King George and Parliament decided that the best way to go forward would be to tax the Americans. Honestly, it kind of made sense to the British because they had spent a lot of money to protect us. However, America saw this as a design by the British to try to restrict some of the natural rights and also the liberties that we had built up during our time so far. We'd been reading Common Sense, we'd been reading Thomas Jefferson, we had been reading John Locke, and so we had these ideas of natural rights and felt that they were not being measured up to. So here is the king, King George III of England, who did this, and he once said, "A traitor is everyone who does not agree with me." Now, this was not the first time that British Parliament had acted to restrict and restrain American liberties to try to ensure England's status as a world power. Go back to the Dominion of New England for evidence of this, where they took all these troublemaking colonies and transformed them into one giant mega colony. But also, they had stopped America from issuing paper money. They kept forcing them to use British money. They stopped the colonies from manufacturing certain items and forced them to buy them from England instead. They had stopped trade between the American colonies and France or Spain or the Dutch, who may even be closer than England, and we might fetch a better price by trading with them. And of course, all of these were laws and things that were ordered from about 3,000 miles away. So sometimes, occasionally, America just decided, whatever, I'm just going to ignore these laws and do what I feel like doing. Now, the British government had also often allowed the colonies to govern themselves. So, for this, think back to things like salutary neglect and the beginnings of the House of Burgesses and the idea that, it's hard to control the Americas when you're 3,000 miles away. So, give them a little leniency as long as they kept sending the best stuff to England. However, after the French and Indian War, they decided that America needed a tightening of control. England reverted to seeing the colonies as servants in the mother country. That they wanted us to make money, raise funds, and finance other wars against rival countries. This is one of the ideas of mercantilism we talked about. And in the minds of the British government, like I said, they had just fought a war for our protection that kind of sort of had been started by one of our own when George Washington attacked the French. in what is now Pennsylvania. And the British had spent about 150 million pounds plus interest in the defense of the colonies. So, in their minds, we should be a little more grateful. However, we did not do very well with the idea of grateful. This is a political cartoon from the time showing old Great Britain trying to pull in the Americans and the Americans doing everything they can to resist, including showing their butt if necessary. Now, the Americans were also not the only people without direct representation. This is, again, the argument of the British. Many places in England didn't have representation in Parliament. The Irish didn't have representation in Parliament. In fact, the Americans were very concerned that what was happening to us had actually just happened to the Irish not too long ago. But this was something that was sort of accepted in the British political theory, that not everybody got their own member of parliament to stand directly for them. However, you had to assume that members of parliament they had your best interests at heart, even if they were not directly representing you. This is what was called virtual representation. Meanwhile, Great Britain expected Americans to basically sit down and shut up and help support the mother country. Again, the idea of mercantilism. But as we see, America grows more and more reticent to this idea. Colonists started to get nervous at first when the British issued what were called writs of assistance. This was to help the British fighting smuggling in America. They started to issue search warrants that allowed British customs officials to search anywhere they wanted to without any sort of any way to stop them. Americans felt that the first of these, written in 1761, went against their rights as Englishmen, as described in the English Bill of Rights. They said, "Look, we're Englishmen, just like anybody else. We have certain rights," and they thought that the British government was extending beyond their regular power. And this only went further when the Proclamation of 1763 came out, which said that the Americans could not move west over the Appalachian Mountains. Again, something that very much angered us, feeling that we had fought in the war for the idea of moving west. Then, in 1764, George Grenville, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, introduced the first of the big taxes against the Americas, called the Sugar Act. Now, interestingly, this shows a repeated problem that the British don't quite understand. It's not the price that bothers America. It's the fact that we're being taxed without our representation. So the Sugar Act actually reduced taxes on American sugar, or on sugar going to the Americas. And that was the carrot, basically, is that, we will lower the price on sugar if you guys stop smuggling from the French. And so that was basically, hey, that sounds great, except for the fact that we have no representation. Also, there was a bit of a stick along with the carrot, which is the idea that the admiralty courts were created, where American smugglers could be charged and convicted of a crime without a jury, and that they could be sentenced to a British prison without ever appearing before a jury. And remember, habeas corpus, that is one of the big ideas of, things like the English Bill of Rights. And so we felt that we were being treated as less than Englishmen. It also restricted the goods that America could take from other countries who had colonies in the Americas. Now, the Sugar Acts were basically putting teeth into the Navigation Acts that had basically been ignored for many, many years. Then England decided that they were going to start up some new taxes against the Americans. First of all, we had the Stamp Act of 1765. This was a direct tax on the colonists, not just a tax on trade like the Sugar Acts had been. This was England implementing a tax on the Americas. And what it said was that any printed goods in America, which mainly had to be sent on paper from England anyway, this included newspapers, books, playing cards, legal documents, all of this had to carry a stamp that you would have to purchase from British authorities as a small tax. And this Stamp Act would go towards funding British troops, protecting America, and it also bypassed colonial assemblies, again meaning that America had no way of having a voice for or against these stamp acts. Here's what the stamp looked like. Now, this turned out to be an incredibly bad idea in hindsight. I'm sure the British did not think it would be this bad. Maybe a few people would get their feathers ruffled. They were not ready for the massive onslaught of resistance that the Stamp Act got them. It angered and affected pretty much every class of Americans, from higher class lawyers to low class sailors on the docks who suddenly had to pay a tax on their playing cards, to writers and lawyers who had to pay for papers so they could write their legal documents. Everybody turned against the British. It also worried colonists that if we were helping to fund a British army in America, it could be used against us one day too. And of course, the big overarching idea is that this was taxation without representation. I think I've heard that on a slogan once or twice, which very much angered the Americans above all else, I would say. So here's the American version of the stamp, that it's going to basically tax us to death. Now, there was a deep disagreement between how colonists around the world saw themselves and how the British saw their colonists. Colonists in general believed that they were equal to the British, that being an Englishman in Virginia was just the same as being an Englishman in London. However, Great Britain saw them as unequal partners, that you are below us, you are inferior to us, especially you are a mercantile country. And if England bent to the will of the American colonies, this would be bad for England and their mindset. If we let these Americans get off the hook and not have to pay these taxes just to kind of keep them from revolting, then that could maybe inspire the Irish or the Scottish or, the Welsh, who knows. It could inspire other people to rise up against the British colonies as well, and so they can't have that. So here we see a famous painting of England as the old woman and America as the young girl, fist fighting with each other. And oftentimes this is sort of something we'd see throughout the American Revolution. When they personified the fight, it was oftentimes a fight between an old woman and her young daughter. Now, the American colonies tended to believe that England had no right to impose any taxes without our direct representation in Parliament. Not this sort of vague mamby-pamby virtual representation. It was more like, no, we need to have the minister, MP from the Americas speaking up in British Parliament. We saw that people like Patrick Henry, who was in the Virginia House of Burgesses, put forward legislation calling to resist these taxes, although most were voted down. Famously, there's one moment where Patrick Henry is giving a speech, and one of his guys just starts yelling, "Treason! Treason!" at him, as if he is about to commit treason, and Patrick Henry has to stop one word away. He is like one word away from committing full-on treason and kind of walks it back after that. Now, we see in 1765, 9 of these colonies met to figure out ways to sort of fight against the Stamp Act. They called this the Stamp Act Congress. And they agreed in this belief that we should have no taxation of Americans without direct representation in Parliament. They also called all colonies to boycott British goods. Boycotting, by the way, is a great way to stop people from doing what you don't want them to do. If you ever want to hit somebody where it hurts, you hit them in the pocketbook. And so these taxes, as we see, these taxes started a whole sort of movement against them. The 13 colonies were not very united before this, but this sort of tax really united the American colonies in a way that nothing else could. However, some still were more on the British side and ignored this call to the Stamp Act Congress. Now, liberty was sort of the catchphrase that we see during this time of the anti-English movement. In fact, liberty was sort of spoken very highly of and spoken quite often. In Boston especially, which was sort of the ground zero for a lot of this movement, There was a tree in Boston Commons dubbed Liberty Tree, and oftentimes when meetings were held at Liberty Tree, or when protests gathered, they protested at Liberty Tree. Um, Now, in order for the 13 different colonies to communicate better, they created what was called a Committee of Correspondence, where they sort of exchanged letters with support and ideas and different opportunities for resistance. And this was started by the colonial elites, but pretty soon it came to include people of all social classes. If we want to stop these taxes, it's going to take everybody, every hand on deck for this. So here is Liberty Tree in the background in Boston with a doll of a Stamp Act tax collector hanging from it. So imagine that you are a tax collector and you're walking by Liberty Tree and you see a doll that's wearing your coat and your hat, and you're like, oh, I may not want to collect these taxes anymore. And that's exactly what happened. They actually got some of the tax collectors to resign their commission. Now, it wasn't all letter writing and it wasn't always dolls either. Sometimes it was real people. So we have groups of active protesters organized by groups like the Sons of Liberty who marched in the streets. They harassed and beat up tax collectors and would even resort to violence if necessary. So, for instance, in August of 1765, a mob that included members of the Sons of Liberty broke into the house of the governor of Massachusetts, a guy named Thomas Hutchinson. And Hutchinson and his family made it out, but that was about all that made it out of the Hutchinson house. They ransacked it, they broke every mirror they could find, and then they burned that sucker to the ground. And so here are also some of the Sons of Liberty tarring and feathering a tax official. This is where you would take somebody, you would strip all their clothes off, you would pour scalding hot tar all over their body, and then just for added, I guess, embarrassment, you would also douse them in chicken feathers. And here we see them forcing this guy to drink tea. Now, these tactics and also the fear of economic boycotts, along with the fear of violence, really worked. In 1766, British Parliament decided to repeal the Stamp Act. However, they couldn't have it look like they had bent to the will of the Americans. That would never do. So actually, on the same day that they got rid of the Stamp Act, they passed the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act said that Parliament had the ability to tax the Americas basically whenever they felt like it. They guaranteed that this fight was not over. This was the end of round one. And here, by the way, is one of my favorite things. There's an anti-Stamp Act teapot made in England. Now, let's continue along this road to revolution. In 1767, we see the enforcement of this Declaratory Act. Parliament set forward a new series of laws to tax the Americans, known as the Townshend Acts. This is named after Charles Townshend, who was the financial minister in Great Britain. And the Townshend Acts created a series of taxes on goods imported to America, covering a wide range of things like lead and paint and glass and tea, which will be important soon. It also continued to beef up this anti-smuggling operation. And slowly, as we see, there's a lot of resistance in a lot of the same ways. So violence is an option. Letter writing is an option, people expressing their opinions through their writing. We also see that economic boycotts work very well. One of the leaders of this was a guy named John Dickinson, who wrote a series of letters called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. So here is John Dickinson, by the way, 1732 to 1808. He was born in Maryland, but he had lived both in Delaware and in Pennsylvania, where he was seen as an author, historian, politician, soldier for a little while. He wrote letters from a Pennsylvania farmer outlining his anger towards the British. He also would actually write a document that tried to make peace with the British at one point, called the Olive Branch Petition. He was sort of divided. So, for instance, John Dickinson was a member of the Continental Congress from Pennsylvania when we passed the Declaration of Independence, but he refused to sign it, believing it was a bad idea. However, he resigned and served in the American Army instead. Later on, he was the president of both Delaware and Pennsylvania as sort of mini colonies after the American Revolution. Now, this call for more boycotts led to Americans seeing a pride in making a go of it by themselves. They felt that, like, if we are gonna, you know, say no to British goods, we're gonna have to make some of our own. Um, and so it became seen as sort of virtuous republicanism to be self sufficient, to make your own goods. And women who were part of this revolution were often called the daughters of liberty, the ones who were making these clothes and supplies and whatever else needed making. Many artisans also welcomed this because it meant that suddenly Americans are buying American. And so, the local blacksmith down the street is like, great, you're not buying from England anymore. And this decreased the supply of British goods, increased the supply of American goods. And so here we see an American made Revolutionary era frock coat made in America. Now, as we saw, Boston is often the ground zero of this sort of movement. We saw the Sons of Liberty. We saw Liberty Tree in Boston. There's a lot of anger in Boston. One of my favorite lines from the musical 1776. Why is it always Boston that breaks the king's peace? And in the end, we see that soldiers were angry with laborers on the docks because, the dock workers thought the soldiers were stealing their jobs. There was a lot of fights going on between some businessmen in Boston versus the soldiers, including John Hancock, who was a major businessman, but one of his major businesses was smuggling from the French West Indies. And finally, this sort of tension was building and building and building until on March 5th, 1770, what started as sort of a bunch of local guys just sort of hassling the guards in Boston led to a fight, which led to shooting between Bostonians and British soldiers. This left 5 Bostonians dead in the street, and it was called the Boston Massacre by the American side. People like Paul Revere, who we're going to meet very soon, took this idea and ran with it, called it the massacre in the street. It created martyrs for the American cause, including a young African-American man named Crispus Attucks, who became one of the first martyrs, not only for the American cause, but later on for abolition as well. He was held up as sort of like, this black man who fought for liberty at the beginning of the war, and now we are fighting for the enslaved, so on and so forth. So here is the Boston Massacre made by Paul Revere. Paul Revere didn't only do the Midnight Ride, he also created the etching that became this famous work of art and propaganda, and we will talk about that one more in class for sure. Now, the soldiers who shot into the crowd in Boston were put on trial, and actually most of them got off. They were acquitted. There were a few who were found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. And John Adams, noted patriot and hater of the British, John Adams, actually defended these guys too. However, like we said, this became propaganda for the American patriots. Now, Americans continued to boycott British goods in protest, and like I said, that's a great way to stop people from doing what you don't like. And eventually, British merchants actually called on Parliament to remove the Townshend Act, saying we're losing too much money. They're not buying British goods. And so Parliament once again agreed, removing all of their taxes from the Townshend Act, except the one on tea. Ruh-roh. However, we continue to see mistrust growing between the Americans and the British. We see new taxes and new rumors growing of more and more taxes and stuff like this too. So the tension has settled, but not a lot. Later on, the next protest movement was over tea. England was trying to save the East India Tea Company, which was slowly dying. And so they said, let's dump this low-priced tea into America. They couldn't possibly object to paying less for their tea. Well, of course we could, because it was, again, they're missing, the British keep missing the big picture, which is it's not the price of the tea. It is the fact that we don't have any sort of say in the taxation on the tea. And tea was very popular. However, again, Americans resisted. We boycotted. There was violence. We refused to offload the tea when it got here. And then on December 16th, 1773, in Boston, once again Boston, bunch of troublemakers there in Boston, a group of colonists threw over 300 chests of tea into Boston Harbor, and this is known as the Boston Tea Party. Um, this is still celebrated to this day. You can still go to reenactments every year on December 16th, 1773. Now, they're also dressed as Mohawk Indians, and again, like I said, it's not because, like, oh, they'll never suspect it's me if I wear this headdress. It was a symbol of the freedom of America that they were dressed as Native Americans. Native Americans were sort of this inherent symbol of freedom. And one might say that trouble is indeed brewing. I will see myself out. Anyway, before that, though, this act was not just considered like, oh, they threw tea overboard. How dare they? I'm not going to be able to drink my Earl Grey with my scone today. This was not just seen as vandalism. This was not just seen as destruction of property. The importance of this is symbolic. It was a symbolic act of American defiance against the British, and boy, did this get the British very upset at Boston and America in general, but Boston in specifics. Boston was shut down after this. Parliament closed the port. They stopped town meetings, which, think of the Puritans. They've always loved their town meetings. They've always had a problem with the king. It allowed for British troops to be housed without our consent in American homes. Think about the Third Amendment to the Constitution, which says you can't do that anymore. These acts that really angered Boston were known as the coercive acts. Now, to coerce someone means to sort of guide them, usually by force, but sort of guiding them towards the right direction. Americans called them the intolerable acts. They were unpardonable. They were something that we could not sustain and could not deal with. And this really united all of the colonies because, remember, this is mostly happening to Boston, but even people in like Georgia, South Carolina thought if it could happen to Boston, they could do the same thing to South Carolina if we angered them. And at the same time, the English are treating some of their other colonies better. So the British are treating the former French territories better than they're treating their own British territories. So the Quebec Act around this time also let them keep speaking French, keep being Catholic, even though everybody else was British Protestant. And the Americans saw this as like, well, they're treating them better than they treat their American colonies. How dare they? And so it created even more and more anti-British anger here in America that we will see in the next section of this chapter.